BenQ claimed the EW3880R is a home entertainment monitor. Now in this review you're going to be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK it can be found for a whopping £1,000, while in the US it can be found for $1,050. Now to kick off this review I just want to quickly mention the top line specs, because you might be wondering what on earth do you get for that money. Well, it's a 37.5 inch IPS panel that runs a resolution of 3840 x 1600, so that's just above 1440p, and you'll get the same sort of PPI as a 1440p ultra-wide monitor. Now as for its refresh rate, it's actually disappointingly stuck at 60Hz. There's no 75Hz or let's say 100Hz or above refresh rate to play around in it, and at this price point you might expect it. Similarly, there's no VRR support, whereby you don't have AMD FreeSync nor Nvidia G-Sync, which might be a letdown for gamers out there. Now with that in mind, the first thing that was of importance to me is the overall color accuracy and how this monitor looks like. Now put across my Datacolor Spider X Elite, and when set to the standard mode through the OSD, I noted a sRGB gamut coverage of 99.4% and 147.5% gamut volume. You can see here also it does well across the board when it comes to Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 standards, showing that it's really a wide color gamut monitor. Now in comparison to the sRGB standard, however, it does exceed it, but when it comes to color accuracy it doesn't quite hit it, with an average delta of 2.96 and a maximum of 7.68, which means it's a little bit of a letdown for those people who want to do some serious color editing work and work in the sRGB space. Now on the flip side, you can go for the Rec 709 mode, and for those who might be quite enthusiastic, you might know that the sRGB and Rec 709 modes are actually quite similar, although a little bit different in certain values. Now I'd want to give a shout out to Adam from PC Monitors for actually making me aware of this. His review will be down in the description below, which goes into a lot more detail than I will in this section, and furthermore goes in a little bit more detail about wide color gamut monitors and the sRGB standards. Now here, the reason I'm mentioning this is because if you set the monitor to the Rec 709 mode through the OSD, you'll find that the gamut volume and the gamut coverage do tighten up in terms of the sRGB standard at 97.9% gamut coverage and 104.7% gamut volume. You can see here the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes do significantly drop. Now in comparison to the sRGB standard, you can see it's a little bit overzealous in terms of the colder tones, and when I put it in terms of color accuracy, you can see here that it does improve a little bit, but it's still not that color accurate, with an average delta of 2.52 and a maximum of 4.41. What I'm trying to convey over here is that the overall color accuracy in sRGB mode, be it in Rec 709 or for example when you're running on the standard configuration, is just a little bit off, and it's quite a shame given the monitor's price tag that you would have expected BenQ to at least integrate an sRGB emulation mode for those people like myself who would be using it. Now another area of disappointment is the overall brightness of the monitor, and indeed here when I tested it via my Calibrite CC Display Plus calibrator, I noted a peak brightness of 205 nits and a minimum of 33 nits in SDR, while in HDR I reached 287 nits. Suffice to say that even in terms of HDR peak brightness, it's pretty disappointing. Given the price tag of the monitor, one might have expected at a very bare minimum 400 nits, but alas that's not the case. And as a result, if you're going to be consuming a lot of HDR content, you might want to look elsewhere for a monitor that can actually achieve better peak brightness and therefore give you a better HDR experience. Now as for its contrast ratio, given it's an IPS panel, it's no surprise to see it hovering at 909:1. Of course it won't compete with VA alternatives out there on the market, but given its panel type in terms of IPS, I think it's perfectly acceptable. Now of course, as for an IPS panel, there comes with backlight bleeds, and in my tested panel, which of course to do with panel lottery, there's a little bit of bleed in terms of the corners, but it's perfectly acceptable and it's something that I wouldn't see batting an eyelid if I were playing really dark games or watching movies. Of course here yet again a VA panel would do a better job. Now as for the overall brightness uniformity, at the top segment of my panel it just didn't do as well as I expected. Again, for a monitor of its price I was expecting pretty perfect brightness uniformity, but again that's not the case. And so what about gaming? Well, here the monitor's input lag is actually pretty good. From my tests I found that the monitor does pretty well across the board, and I had no such issues in terms of registering my input. It's not as low as one might expect in comparison to hardcore gaming monitors out there, particularly for those people who are consider themselves competitive gamers, but in the grander scheme of things for an ultra-wide monitor, I was definitely left impressed. Similarly, when it comes to its response time, there's very little inverse ghosting even in its highest AMA mode. In other words, the overdrive modes, you've got 3 to select from. In terms of its highest mode, you don't actually incur that much inverse ghosting, and therefore gives you actually a pretty responsive screen, which got me by surprise. However, its 60Hz refresh rate and the lack of any VR support just lets it down, and as a result means that, well, other than the multimedia concept that you're going to be consuming, this monitor might not be that appealing for gamers. Of course, FPS gamers will want to look elsewhere, but for those people who are more casual gamers, again, you might be left a little bit disappointed with the lackluster number of features that the BenQ monitor is offering. Now, for console gamers, this monitor has 2 HDMI 2.0 ports which support HDR and also have a 4K signal input, and as a result means that you can run that on Xbox or PlayStation. Now, as for the former, the Xbox supports 1440p resolution as well, and it will run on this monitor and also at Full HD resolution. However, on the PlayStation you'll be limited to the Full HD resolution because Sony does not support 1440p natively. Now, moving on to the monitor's OST, can be accessed through a joystick button found behind the monitor and via the included remote, which I find a quite handy inclusion. Now, moving into the settings itself, you've got the different inputs, and which will be pretty self-explanatory, but these little boxes over here designate for you to have a split screen type of effect or a picture-in-picture mode, so therefore useful if you have different type of inputs. Now, as for the picture settings, you've got brightness and contrast, which will very much depend on your own personal preferences and furthermore your ambient light conditions. And as for sharpness, I would run it at 5. The advanced mode, the display mode, you'll probably want to run it on full majority of the time, but if for some reason you want to adjust it, well, you've got it through this menu over here. Now, as for super resolution, I would leave this disabled, adds a somewhat artificial amount of sharpness, which just doesn't look good to my eyes. Now, as for the color mode, I did reference these before in the picture mode, but the standard mode is probably what you're going to want to run for the vast majority of time. If you do want that little bit more compressed gamut, then you have got the Rec 709 mode, and then you've also got the user mode, which unlocks a few other settings within the advanced tab, such as hue and saturation. While we're in this tab, I should also talk about gamma. You've got a variety of different gamma adjustments that you can do, and then you've also got the AMA settings, which are relating to its response time. So of course, premium giving you the best sort of response time of the monitor, while also incurring a slight bit of inverse ghosting. I did touch upon this before, so if you do want to see what I was talking about there, just rewind the video. Now, as for the color temperature, normal is what I would suggest for most people. You can go for blue or reddish, or you can go via user define, where you can adjust the RGB values to your heart's content. As for HDR mode, its HDR reproduction, as I did mention throughout this review, was just not that impressive, specifically when it comes to peak brightness, but you've got the Cinema HDRI and Game HDRI modes to choose from, but I suspect most people will prefer the regular HDR mode because it just results in far better color reproduction. Now, as for the audio tab, I must say I'm actually pretty impressed. Now, this monitor has got 2 3-watt speakers and a singular 8-watt woofer. Combined, they've got a 2.1 channel configuration, and if you were to go via the cinema or the live and pop mode EQs, I think you'll find that the overall sound quality is actually seriously impressive. I'm normally not someone who would normally shout about audio quality of a monitor, but in this case I think BenQ should really be commemorated for the overall audio quality that they've produced. It left me really impressed. My only complaint, however, is the overall lowest volume that you can get. Now, this monitor does get pretty loud, and most times I think you'll be running it at level 20 to level 10, but in its lowest mode, so level 1, I just find that it wasn't as low as I'd want it to be. And the reason why is because if you can, for example, gaming at night, then you might want to have it a little bit lower. Nevertheless, BenQ have incorporated a night mode where you've got level 1 and level 2. I didn't find this to be all that useful because it's supposed to be boosting the overall vocals, but I found it to be kind of somewhat artificially boosting the low end in some ways. But anyway, it's there for you to enable or disable if you want, and of course you can mute the monitor if you want as well. Now, this monitor has got a sensor at the front of it and therefore allows you to customize certain settings. These are BI+, which you can enable or disable, and you can also have it, for example, working on a light meter and adjust the sensitivity settings settings. And as for the duration and the eye reminder, they're always just useful to have there, but the low blue light mode as well is something that you might want to use. As for color weaknesses, for people who have weaknesses in certain colors, and therefore BenQ have incorporated this directly into their OSD settings. You've got 2 customized keys which you can do. It seems to be a little bit limited as to what you can do, but nevertheless it is there for you to choose and for you to play around with should you wish to use that settings. Now as for the system setup, you've got the OSD settings, the USB-C configuration, which are all pretty self-explanatory. The LED indicator which resides at the front of the monitor can be enabled and disabled, and also furthermore you can see what the resolution and the refresh rate of the monitor is by going onto the information tab through the OSD menu. So with the OSD section out of the way, let's talk about the build quality and the stand. And first off here, the monitor provides a height, tilt and pivot adjustment, and of course it can't be rotated given the sheer size of it. It's a 37.5 inch ultra-wide after all. Now here the monitor stand is also pretty sturdy and had no problems whatsoever on my desk. Furthermore, its design is pretty slender despite the sheer size of the monitor, and therefore means it will fit on most desk setups, at least in my opinion. Now as for the overall look of the stand, it's got this kind of copper type of finish, and the same could be said about the bottom bezel of the monitor, which looks aesthetically appealing, at least in my opinion, and here I feel that it will sit in most sort of desktop setups with ease. Now the monitor also has got a 3-side borderless design, which means it takes a little bit less space on your desk, but of course you'll want to accommodate for it given the sheer size of it. Now of course if you don't want to use the built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA 100x100mm stand. The only thing to bear in mind over here is the sheer size and weight of this BenQ ultrawide monitor. Now as for connectivity, you've got 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, which will definitely suffice given the resolution and refresh rate of this monitor, and you've got USB Type-C. Now the Type-C port also delivers 60 watts of power, which makes it quite handy for laptop users who want to charge while simultaneously using the monitor as a secondary or primary display. Now I should also mention that I'm a little bit disappointed that BenQ haven't included a KVM switch, which would have been handy for those people who have multiple different source inputs, so for example a laptop and a computer, and therefore could have used all their peripherals connected up to the monitor rather than having to resort to plugging them in and out of their different source devices. And so now we get onto my verdict, and here the BenQ EW3880R is just a disappointment. I was expecting this monitor to do really well across the board, specifically given its overall asking price, but alas it doesn't. Gamers will look for a higher refresh rate than 60Hz, want VRR support and also HDR, which goes more than 280 nits, which is really laughable to be quite honest with you. As for image editors or video graders, you'll want a monitor that has a dedicated sRGB, DCI-P3 and or Adobe RGB color modes, which this monitor just does not have. And as for productivity people out there, you'll want a monitor that has a built-in KVM switch because it makes it quite handy when you're switching between sources. Quite frankly, the best selling point of this monitor is its overall aesthetics, its comprehensive OSD and its inclusion of its remote control, and also the fact that its built-in speakers are seriously impressive. Now, if that's what you want, then let me know in the comments below, because I'd be very much intrigued to know why you'd be going for this monitor over the alternatives. And yes, there's some alternatives down in the description below for you to consider, and ones that I would recommend. Also down there you'll find links to my social media platforms, so I'd very much appreciate a follow on Instagram or on Twitter. And yes, that's a shameless plug. Now if you've liked this independent detailed review and want to see more, and if you haven't already, do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.